The next session is Developing Downtown for the Future. Joining Dennis Archer Jr. on stage, please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Bedrock, LLC, Kofi Bonner. The Chief Executive Officer of Brinker Group, Larry Brinker Jr. And Principal of Queen Lillian, Chris Jackson.
What's up, bro?
You know, Antoine mentioned, I don't know if you heard Antoine, but he told the audience that he was going to take them to church this morning. I'm looking at the stage. I'm like, if Reverend Anthony was here, they might think this is an NAACP meeting up here on the stage. I could say that. Let me start.
Wait a minute, isn't it?
Yeah. We're here to talk about downtown development, but what I find is interesting. So Larry Brinker, the original, lives across the street, and I've noticed he's had much more time to mow his lawn and to walk his grounds, and that's because he's got a son who's at the helm of the business. Larry, talk to us about being a second-generation entrepreneur and what it means for you to take the company in your direction, and what is that direction? Because I know it includes not just construction, but also development.
Absolutely. I'll say I am one of the luckiest people in the world to have the opportunity to, work with my father every day, to have the opportunity to take something so special that he built and to leave my own legacy. He recently told me last week, he sent me a text and said, hey, proud of everything you do, but the thing that I'm most proud of is the fact that it's not about the success, it's not about the money, but it's about truly providing opportunity and helping to change lives. And so for myself, it's really exciting to be able to take what he's built, to continue to professionalize it, and leave that legacy for our family. And even as it relates to construction of what we do, the most amazing thing is to be able to walk around the city and see buildings that will be here for the next 100 years that our great-great-grandkids can talk about and feel a part of the community based on what we've done.
Talk to us while I'm with you, Larry, for a second about, I think everyone here knows of the tremendous work that you all do as one of the city's largest construction companies. But talk to us about, you've got a couple development projects going where you are actually a developer as well. Talk to us about those projects.
Yeah, so my father is an equity partner in the Bagley Development Group, which is the redevelopment of the United Artists building, which I believe he's here tonight or today. But that is
somebody else must be tending to the grounds at the house. If you
yeah. So for that development, we're bringing 148 new apartments to the city of Detroit, and it's exciting when you think about just where the city is, where the city's heading. The fact that we're currently bringing, and this is just based on different facets of construction right now, but in 23, we're bringing over 400 apartment units to downtown Detroit, between us being a developer and a construction manager as well.
That's fantastic. You mentioned legacy a couple different times in your comments. Chris, I'm going to move to you now. Even into the name of your most recent development, Chris Jackson has been a developer in one shape or form for decades, one of the original partners in the Greektown Casino that managed that through it being built. But your most recent project on Woodward has a lot to do with legacy for both you and Jim. Tell us about the name, the project, and the path you got to where you are now with it being complete.
Well, legacy is important. It's how you connect something that's a product or something physical, and then something that the spiritual component of something. So our company, Queen Lillian, is named after actually two great women who who had nurtured both me and actually our original partner was Don, the late Don Davis, who, as many of you know, was president, CEO of First Independence Bank. Don's mother's name was Queen, and my mother's name is Lillian. And so 14 years ago when we founded Queen Lillian, it was to really, the spirit of those two ladies, what they had done for me and Don, and they were everything to us. And so Jim Jenkins became our partner, and so we had embodied that spirit of developing something here for the city of Detroit. We wanted it to have that meaning and that connection to those ladies.
Kofi,
as it relates to what we are doing now, we did, as you mentioned, just develop a 204-unit mixed-use development there on Woodward, working in partnership with the platform. It's been tremendous working with Peter Cummings and his team, and they have even embraced that energy of what we have brought with Queen Lillian.
It's much more authentic, is it not? I mean, it's a heartfelt project.
Oh, it is. I mean, it was something that I used to walk by that site. I was a student at Cass Tech. And where we are at Woodward and Stimson, really, as many of you would know, and not far from here, was called the Cass Corridor. We have now rebranded much of Cass Corridor, and we're calling it Midtown. But I walked by that site as a student, going back, I hate to say how many years, but, going back over 35 years ago. And that was a site that has always been abandoned, did not have the investment. Jim and I, we did go to acquire that site over 10 years ago and worked very diligently, working with the city, various partners, to try to bring something to that site. All that was pre Little Caesars Arena, pre the M1 rail, pre Mike Ilitch School of Business and Boston Consulting. None of that had been developed there on that west side of Woodward when we had first acquired the site. But we had some vision there that we knew the energy, it was coming. And we may be sort of now the most recent development there after all those others, but I think our vision is what fed those other developments to say, yes, there is something valuable here.
Kofi, you have lived around the world. When you were approached to come to Detroit to take this position to run Bedrock, what sold you on coming to Detroit?
In many ways, it became very simple once my wife and I landed in Detroit, because our memory of Detroit was from the 1998, 2005, when I was working with the Cleveland Browns, and I'd come through Detroit a few times then. And so I wasn't quite sure I was ready to come back to the Midwest, even though I had a great time in Cleveland. And then I was convinced to get here. And once I got here, I was amazed at the transformation. But that wasn't quite it. In fact, my very first comments to the team that I met here was, you all don't need me. You've done such a fabulous job bringing the city from where I remembered it to where it is today, that I said, you don't need me. I might be helpful in finding somebody who could perhaps become the CEO. And then I had a terrific conversation with Dan and Jen Gilbert. And it was in that conversation that I was convinced that perhaps I might actually be able to get off the couch and come to Detroit, because Dan said something very, very simply to me. Because I asked him, I said, okay, well, what do you want from this? What do you want from Bedrock? And he looked at me and he said, you know what? What I want to do is I want to return Detroit to its rightful place as a 21st century world-class city. He wasn't talking about, going to grow my portfolio, I want to grow the bottom line. He was talking about a mission that spoke straight to my heart. And I said, you know what? I can do that. I can help with that at least. That's why my wife and I came.
That's fantastic, and I've had a chance to meet her. She's lovely. Tell her I said hello. With all that's gone on in COVID, there's a lot that people are contemplating as relates to, well, what will happen with all the office space. The panel directly before ours was back to work and flexible work. How has, well, I'm one, but in general, how has coming out of the pandemic affected your existing hospitality and retail tenants? And then secondly, your ability to attract at the same pace that you have been new hospitality and retail tenants to come downtown?
Sure. I think, I can't emphasize enough, and I know folks have been talking about it, but I'd like to just add my 2 cents on this. I mean, what we have seen over the last 2.5 years, and we still are seeing, is a structural shift in the way downtowns, frankly, are being developed. I mean, the pandemic did so many things. Certainly, it devastated downtowns, as we know. It accelerated this movement towards remote work, which we know. It's changed the way the supply chain system works, which we have experienced in the construction business. And if you think about those things, it just has, and look, many of the buildings that we're currently building or are being completed today was started in a different marketplace and a different economy. And just think about that for a minute. I mean, and yet, congratulations to folks for just persevering and continuing. So we have to think differently about how we move forward with downtowns. Downtowns are still incredibly important to the metros areas. They're incredibly important. They absolutely still have to attract people. Our designs of offices are changing. We have to make sure those office spaces are highly amenitized so that when those workers are in the office, they actually feel a sense of, hopefully, elation that they're not glued to a screen and they're back in the office. And we also have to make sure that the spaces outside of the offices, those interstitial public spaces, are full of activity and are exciting and amenitized so that folks come downtown more often. And last but not least, we absolutely have to make sure that the downtown is seen as a place for everybody.
Absolutely.
Everybody. So specifically to our efforts, I think I heard a speaker earlier talk about perception changing in Detroit, and that is clearly assisting us in our ability to bring people in. We're having great conversations with sort of national retailers and national and luxury brands, actually, where several years ago, apparently, they wouldn't really speak to us. So they are talking to us. And those that are coming here finally are being buffeted by some of the same things that I know you as a business person here, and we talked about it, Larry. You have to find people to work in these places. And finding the people is not easy. So we're having great conversations. We remain totally bullish on the downtown, but we also recognize that, as I said before, there's a structural shift in the way downtowns are having to position themselves. That means we have to think differently about how we're building out the downtowns, which means the ecosystem around us, including our public-private partners, have to think differently about how perhaps they might support the downtowns growing, because things are changing and they're not totally settled, as we know.
Chris, Kofi mentions private, public. In your experience, which you have a lot of, you've actually worked in the city council space. You've worked in and around government, and you're a business person. What could change here from a policy perspective, in your opinion, to make it more attractive to develop and invest in Detroit?
So one of the things, and you're right, I wear a number of hats. I sit on the Economic Development Corporation board, which we're very much involved with the very popular program called Motor City Match, which is a great sort of private, public-private type partnership where you're helping these entrepreneurs with these entrepreneurial spaces. And so I get a chance to sort of see how these smaller emerging businesses, what needs that they need, or the needs that they need assistance to be either start a business, develop that business, for it to evolve. One of the things we've noticed that there's so much attention on incentivizing developers for affordable housing, for instance. But I think we need that same level of attention as relates to that emerging entrepreneur. And so that if I had the incentives that I have, as relates to the residential component of my development, to attract the emerging entrepreneur, that I can give them lower rent. Because in order to make my numbers work, I'm charging, we're looking at $30, $40 a square foot for retail space, but the emerging entrepreneur cannot afford that.
Right.
And so one of the things I think could happen is that more of these tools to help the entrepreneur, very similar to what we're doing to attract and have more inclusive and affordable housing, would be something that I think would be great as we're talking about developing that downtown, that ecosystem that Kofi is talking about. We want to make sure, just as we have the national chain restaurants or national chain stores, how we have these emerging entrepreneurs can be on that same playing field. And I know Bedrock is doing a lot in that space, trying to have these partnerships. We're doing the same thing. We actually created an emerging entrepreneur space, so much square footage, but you can only do so much of that without maybe more partnership with government.
It's a great idea. Larry, there's a time, like every time, at least my phone would ring and it would be a construction company. It's kind of like you see the parking ticket person coming and you're like, nobody wants to deal with them because the call is about some cost increase. Right. So I think we all know.
Welcome to my world.
Right. So I think we all are aware that the cost of construction has gone up astronomically, 45% over the last several years. Do you see that changing? I mean, obviously, you have to drive your costs and your price increases because your subs costs you increase, and it's across the industry. But do you see a slowdown in that increase?
It's a great question, Dennis. I can tell you, for instance, the Book Tower project that we're working on with Kofi, at one point, we literally were receiving emails from our suppliers on a weekly basis. And it was, hey, next week, prices are increasing by 30%, and you can only order what you've ordered in the past, historically on average, so we couldn't stock load or stock up on material, which forced us into these escalations. There's so many different variables that go into it. You think about, for instance, our electrical company, for a typical piece of switchgear that would most times take, say, 12 to 13 weeks to receive. It's taking 60 weeks plus to receive now, but the cost impact to that is just as great. You think about breakers for electrical panels were being manufactured in the Ukraine and Russia, things that we don't think about. But those all drive those cost increases. But with that being said, there are so many different variables that go into it. It's very hard to say if the prices are going to trend downwards and correct, or if they're going to continue to increase. You look at, for instance, I'll give you an example. When you take metal or steel compared to wood, lumber traditionally goes up and down, but metal and steel always follows the price of lumber. So once it goes up, it never goes back down, right? So there's just so many different variables. It's very hard to pinpoint whether or not it will correct. Our hope is it will, because we never like being the bearer of bad news to clients like Kofi when we have to come in and say, hey, in the last 3 weeks, the price has increased by X. And it's nothing we've done. We're not making any money off of it. We're simply passing that cost to our clients.
So I think, I think that's a great point, and it's part of what I consider this structural shift that is happening. And the reason it's important to, I think, Larry, for in this instance is, as costs are certainly rising, I think, Chris, you would agree, costs are certainly rising way faster than the rents and revenues that you can. That disconnect, what it really does is acts as a brake to development. it acts as a brake to development. And so that's where we strive to get those public-private partnerships to help sort of fill that gap in some measure. And so if anything, we are constantly thinking through more creative ways to work with our public partners to assist us to try to close these gaps, because these real life circumstances are what may be the biggest threat in some respects, because at some point you just cannot continue to pour costs in knowing full well that the revenues won't be there. I mean, look, you look at some of these cities, they are able to bridge those gaps because their revenues are rising actually fairly high. I read about, I think, an office development, I think it's in New York, that was going to get $200 a foot on rent. Great.
Wow.
I would suggest to you that the costs associated with that office building may not be that much higher than here, but the revenues associated with it won't be there. But we all recognize that that's our reality, so the ability to create those public-private partnerships and creative financing systems and involve our whole financing ecosystem, including certainly locally, but also the state and perhaps the feds, I think are going to be critical for our continued momentum.
Kofi, let me stick with you for a second. Gucci opened a few months ago, actually around the corner from my office. They're a great neighbor. How important is it to Detroit and for your efforts, given your portfolio, to have an international brand like Gucci plop right downtown?
Oh, I think it's really important because, you know, with all due respect to the retailers here, that they watch each other, and in some respects they follow trends. And the ability for us to point to the fact that someone has taken a bet on downtown in Detroit and is doing well actually helps us have those other conversations with actually like other luxury brands. But even perhaps as importantly is what Chris said. We now are able to find that real creative, successful local entrepreneur in the retail space and find a space for them fairly close by so that they can benefit off that foot traffic that perhaps goes to a Gucci or to some other national brand. And that's what we try to do to help sort of the local entrepreneurs get a little more perhaps business.
Chris, you know, folks that are either in their professional career or they're entrepreneurs often look to diversify by investing into real estate. What advice would you give someone who that is not their primary business focus, but would perhaps like to look at real estate as hopefully a safer investment to deploy some of their funds?
Don't do it. Don't do it.
One thing about it, and I'm so bullish on Detroit. I mean, we are very fortunate that we just have this wealth of property and land that much of it is available and affordable. When you start looking at the coast, West Coast, East Coast, you cannot buy a house or land or lots at the price that you can get it for here. And I think listening to Mr. Florida, as he talked about earlier, that is one of our sort of secret sauce about Detroit, that the point of entry, I think, is a lot cheaper, you know, if you are a budding real estate developer. And so I would say, you know, the key to anything is land acquisition. It is getting a hold of the property. There's a lot of property there at the land bank, and that the mayor has done a great job with that, making that available to sort of that upstart. And, you know, it is definitely something that, you know, there's not going to be any new dirt manufactured. So we have, as long as it's still available, we have dirt, we have land, and then you go figure it out from there. You know, it's, as with our project Woodward West, as I said, we went to acquire that site almost 10 years ago before the market really started to come to the Cass Corridor, but I had land control, and then you start to figure out the development from that point on. So I think that is something, and as we talk about being, you know, Kofi and Larry and I, we had talked some time ago about being intentional when we start talking about diversity, inclusion, and people having opportunity. We have a lot of things that are in place that where the city has been very intentional, be it opportunities there at the land bank, Motor City Match, things like that to help these budding developers and entrepreneurs. We have to continue that intentional spirit when we talk about downtown or any kind of development in the city.
Larry, Chris mentions obviously diversity and inclusion, and you all talked previously about intentionality. Do you feel that you all, as an African-American owned Detroit headquartered company, are getting a fair look at deals and opportunities?
Yeah, I can tell you, I believe we are, but it's never easy, right? Our company is built on, first and foremost, just being a quality contractor, happens to be owned by people of color, right? But we can put ourselves up against our competitors and offer and provide the same level of service and quality and craftsmanship. But every day is a struggle. I mean, every day we do have to work twice as hard and be twice as good as some of our competitors to get that fair shot. But it's in our DNA, it's who we are, and more than anything, I think for me being, I would say the youngest on the stage is, my goal would be 10 years from now for it just to be a course of business. It's not where we're calling it out, but it's just the right thing to do. And no different than you look at the city of Detroit, the number of developers of color like Chris in the city. It would be great to fast forward 10 years and not have the same conversations we're having today.
Kofi, as we look to close, I'll end with you and ask you, you travel internationally fairly significantly. Are there things that you've seen, trends that you see as you travel globally that you think would benefit Detroit, whether it be placemaking or some sort of development trend that you think we would benefit from?
Sure. Thank you. I think the placemaking, all the things we currently do and the city does very well, we absolutely have to continue. But I would just emphasize this, that again, I'm going to talk about that structural shift again, because I truly believe it's important to recognize that those policies of the past were for a different economy and a different time pre-pandemic, pre-Ukraine, pre-pandemic, through these disruptions. So as we go forward, we absolutely have to think about how to grow the pie. And the only tried and true way I have seen around the world is through the supporting the innovation ecosystem, because innovation fundamentally creates businesses and creates jobs, creates product and process improvements. It grows the academic and educational institutes. And so perhaps we need to be much more intentional. And I think there are some really wonderful things that are going on in this city, but I would say we should, using that word again, be very intentional about growing that innovation support ecosystem, because in that, we find that cities that were maybe somewhat on not so great times have used innovation to climb and soar. And I think we have a unique opportunity to do so in almost every industrial sector.
So, in closing, I want to thank the three of you, because each of you in your own lanes are doing a tremendous amount to help Detroit grow and prosper, job creation, continuing to put us on the map, and being game changers in a lot of ways, each of you. So thank you for being here. Thank you to the audience for your graciousness.
Thank you. Thank you.